may be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. Lamont, you may continue.
All right, we started talking about the MCMI, right?
Yes, well, I don't think we actually talked
We
about
mentioned it.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, can you tell us what the MCMI is? What is it?
It's the most standardized measure in our field to look specifically at at personality disorders, including borderline, paranoid, etc. So it actually is designed to assess personality disorders.
Okay, and how is it designed to do that?
By actually focusing on that population in the research and looking at what kinds of responses people who do have known personality disorders show up and how they respond. So that's what's been done over a long period of time, decades, in designing and updating and standardizing that measure. So it actually is specifically geared more to looking at the personality disorders.
All right, so let's say then we were talking about if there's this hypothesis of borderline personality disorder, is this the test then that you would want to see the results of?
Yes, ma'am.
I'll give you a second. You're not the first one.
Came out a little bit too fast. I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. So if we're going to conduct an MCMI test with a working hypothesis of borderline, then is that would be something accurate, or that would be something that you would want to do maybe as the next step?
Well, if you're again looking at that hypothesis or the possibility, yes, that would be what would be appropriate. Okay. Or if you've already administered these tests, then you'd look at it. I mean, a lot of times you don't know the hypothesis ahead of time, and you would administer a battery of tests, and then you would go through, the person would have taken all of them, and then you go back and look at each one, working through it like, more or less like we're doing. But it's really unusual to give a test and score it, interpret it, and then say, oh, well, I want to do this, and then go. So if you already have an idea of the areas you want to explore, you would normally give all those tests at more or less the same time.
Okay. And in this particular case, are you aware that Ms. Arias was given the MCMI test?
Yes.
And did you review the profile results?
Yes.
All right. And I'm showing you Exhibit 541. What are we looking at in Exhibit 541?
These are the profile results for this particular test. It's a different format, which isn't relevant. It's just different tests are viewed differently, but it's the same idea. So, but this is scored a little bit differently. So when you look at this 75 here, that would be more of what we would call our clinical cutoff. They don't call this T-scores, and they call it base rates, but the idea is somebody who's at 75 or above, that's in the clinical range or the areas we'd want to look at. So the first three scales here, okay, I didn't do, all right, so there are what is called the validity scales, like we were talking about before, and whether the person is attempting to distort their answers, fake good, fake bad, things like that, lie. So these different ones look at whether they're willing to disclose, that's the first one, whether they are trying to answer a little bit more favorable. In other words, this particular elevation here at 67 means it's above average. It's not clinical, but it's above average, meaning the person may be trying to present themselves in a little bit more favorable way than they really are. And then this is putting themselves down. Are they actually trying to look worse than they are? And that's not. So when you get a score that's starting to get elevated, if you get it way up here, then you start worrying about validity. In other words, is this test able to be interpreted? correctly. But when you start getting in this range or up here, then you start thinking, well, this profile might actually be a little bit lower than is what occurs in reality.
Okay,
So it's
let me stop you there so we
Yes.
can understand. So based on these, the top 3 scales here, the validity scales, overall, can you tell us, is this test going to be considered valid?
Yes.
Okay. And then you were talking about the desirability scale, and we see that that's at a 67, which you were saying that's not at the clinical level?
It's correct, but it's
Okay.
above average.
Right. So explain to us then the above average on that particular, the desirability.
Well, it just means that you don't go crazy. It's not in the clinical range. You're not having an invalid. But it says there's a tendency on this person to, on this particular test, to perhaps try to look a little bit better, a little bit more favorable than they might actually be in real world, real life. And so in a clinician's or a diagnostic way, you sort of assume then that you would move the profile up a little bit, but you're still going to look at what are the high scales. But it means that, again, it could mean that these scales are actually a little bit lower than they would be if the person, if this scale was down here, for example, like these others, then the assumption is that all these scales in here probably would be up just a little higher, not a particular scale, just in general. Did that help?
Not really.
Okay.
With the desirability scale, and you see that it's elevated, what does that mean for like something like one of the other scales, like PTSD? We see it's at 69.
Well, it means that in reality, if this person had completely answered in a way that wasn't desirable at all, that 69 could be a little bit higher, and you might need to pay attention to it. But again, we're talking about working hypothesis. We're not saying we're going to go overboard, and again, we're not going to diagnose somebody just on one test, but we're starting to look for patterns among the tests.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about our working hypothesis back to borderline personality disorder.
Yes.
What do we see with regard to the MCMI, a test that, as you say, is specifically designed to detect personality disorders?
Yes, so one of the ones you just mentioned is right here, borderline personality disorder, and you can see it says a score of 11, which is right here, which is, if anything, in the low or below average category. It's not elevated, it's definitely not one of the major scales, so that would tend to indicate that your working hypothesis is not likely correct.
Okay. And then what about if we have a working hypothesis for anxiety or trauma or PTSD? Can we learn anything from these scales based on that working hypothesis?
Under the same conditions that you don't want to go overboard, specifically because this test is not designed to actually diagnose others, but it gives you a working hypothesis again. Anxiety right here is at the clinical level. PTSD, which is the second highest scale, is there. This is not in the clinical area, but it is elevated, but this is. So that would support a working hypothesis of an anxiety disorder or PTSD. Again, that's the way you would view it. You wouldn't, based on, if I had only given this test, I wouldn't go out and say this person has PTSD or an anxiety disorder. But at the same token, I wouldn't say they had a borderline personality disorder. So you have to put everything together. That's the pieces of the puzzle. But this would not support borderline, and if anything, would support more anxiety-oriented things.
All right. And the fact that we have the PTSD scale at 69, so not clinical, when you talk about pieces of the puzzle, is that still a piece of the puzzle even though it's not in that clinical range?
Yes, it's still going with your working hypothesis of it's definitely the second highest scale, and so it's something to consider. And so theoretically, your next steps would be, well, let's test out. If we think that this person is suffering from PTSD or a trauma or an anxiety disorder, let's administer trauma inventories or something specifically designed to assess trauma. That would be appropriate.
Okay. All right. So, and as far as you know, the trauma inventories were given to Ms. Arias, right?
Yes.
Okay. And trauma inventory, the TSI-1, can it be computer scored as well as hand scored?
Yes.
And are you, well, Judge, may I approach? Okay, I'm showing you exhibit 629 and 628. And then I'm showing you also exhibit 646. So 628 and 629, are those hand scored?
Yes, this would be, well, this is the profile you would end up with. Usually if you hand score it, you get the numbers and then you plot it and it goes on a graph like this. And the other one, I don't know what number you said, 646, would be the computer scoring printout of the same test. It just puts it in computer forms, and it does a profile with this that tells you what's going on with it as well.
Okay, and can you review that to tell us if the computer scoring matches the hand scoring?
The scales that are on this form are all matched the ones from the computer score. The computer score also does additional summary scales that's not on this form.
Okay, so the hand scored forms don't have any summary scales on it?
That's correct. You would write them in.
Okay, and the computer printout form, the computer scored form, is that something that you did?
Yes, ma'am.
And how
well,
did...
my staff did it and I checked it.
Okay.
I think one of them, I believe the postdoc fellow actually ran it on the computer and I double checked it.
Okay, and when that gets run on the computer, how is it that you were able to do that?
We have the scoring programs for these various tests. So on the trauma symptom inventory, especially since we were a research site and we've been using it ever since, we actually have the computer scoring program. I mean, people can buy it, but we're a training institute, so we have those things. So we have that. We also have the one for MMPI. We also have the one for MCMI. So many of these things we're able to do as part of the training of our graduate students and doctoral students, or as part of research.
Okay, and did you have what's called raw data, or basically Ms. Arias's answers, to be able to then feed into the computer to get this computer score?
Yes, ma'am.
And is that how it's done?
Yes, ma'am.
Generally speaking?
Well, they could actually take the test on the computer, too. We don't tend to do that. We tend to give them the questions, let them fill out an answer sheet, and then we transfer it to the computer.
Okay, but you never met Ms. Arias, right?
That's correct.
So you're working from what you've received?
That's correct.
Okay. And with regard, is it 646?
Yes, ma'am.
So does that reflect an accurate scoring of this raw data that Dr. DeMarte had given you, that you've seen?
Yes, ma'am.
And the computer scoring added the summary scales to that?
That's correct.
And do those summary scales then match or make sense with what the raw data that you saw going in?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And Judge, at this time, defense would move into Exhibit 646.
Any objection?
I haven't seen it, so I need to know it. No objection.
All right, and Dr. Gaffney, you told us some of the things that your institute does with regard to trauma. Do you have other specialized training with regard to trauma?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you do speaking engagements or training? What is it? How do you have this additional expertise in training or trauma?
It actually grew out of working with abused women and children and child abuse victims. We realized that there was a major connection to trauma. So back in the early 1980s, I started actually doing more research on trauma and actually started going to specific trainings with some of the people around the country. We continued to work. We then began to assess for trauma. We did some of our own research with the clinic I had set up and also at the university and at the crisis center and shelter for battered women and children that I helped build. So we were doing research and training and practice all in this area. And then I ended up getting involved in establishing major organizations dealing with this and still do.
All right. And what about part of being a psychologist is do you do any type of articles, like writing articles for journals or chapters for books or books?
All of the above. I have co-authored books in these various topic areas, including trauma, domestic violence, child abuse. I actually haven't counted lately. I think I've edited or co-edited or written or co-written probably about 45 books going back into the early 1980s. Chapters in books, research and other types of articles in what's called peer-reviewed journals. I actually have not counted how many I've done, to be honest. It's something we regularly do, and we train our people. So the research that I'm supervising, for example, we work with them as they become professionals to publish their work and present them at conferences. So I oversee quite a bit of that as well, and do training myself all over the country and in other countries about trauma, about domestic violence, about how they're all interconnected, and how they affect children, how they affect victims, treatment programs. We've designed treatment programs for victims and for offenders and for children, published books on that, hosted national think tanks on dealing with children exposed to violence growing up in homes like this. All those I'm involved in a variety of different ways.
And what about peer review? What does peer review mean?
With journals, which is the way you actually look at the research, when you have, say, an article, clinical article or treatment, in other words, or research, to get it published in a reputable journal, the journal would need to be peer reviewed and usually anonymous. So that what that means, like with the journals I edit, an article gets submitted to us, and that we send it out to people who are known in the field, who are on my boards, to review this. But they don't know who the author is, and the author doesn't know who reviewed it, because we have like 100 people for each journal. And they provide feedback, and they make recommendations as to whether this meets scientific merit, whether this is worthy of publication. Based on that, it goes through processes of revision until the quality is acceptable to reviewers. That's what peer review means. For research to be recognized, others have to have reviewed it to make sure it was done appropriately, to make sure it actually is meaningful, and a whole bunch of things that we don't need to go into. But then it gets published. And the peer-reviewed, good journals are all peer-reviewed. They're all usually anonymous, what we call double-blind. So reviewers don't know who the authors don't know who the reviewers are, and then us in the editorial process make the final decisions to get something published. So
are you involved in the editorial process?
Yes, ma'am.
On several journals?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know which ones?
I hope so.
Which ones?
I'm the editor of the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma. That's been out 15 years. It deals with all areas and it comes out 10 times a year. I'm the editor of the Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma. It's newer. It's been out about 7 years now. It comes out 4 times a year. These get disseminated worldwide. I'm also the editor of the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse. That's the oldest journal I've been involved in. It's in its 22nd year. And I'm also the editor now of the Journal of Family Violence. These are different publishers that do this. And we have staff. We train our doctorate students and others. I have a whole staff that works with me on the editorial process. So this is a major operation. The Journal of Family Violence comes out 8 times a year. So they all come out different times, but they all get disseminated to professionals worldwide. That's how people get educated about what the current research tells you. That's how we can know for example, that there was no floating profile because somebody has done the research on it and it gets published in peer-reviewed journals that mental health and other professionals have access to, either online or hard copies. So yes, we're involved in all that.
Okay. And earlier when you were speaking about Dr. Gatchell writing some articles about floating profiles, are those things that were actual research and peer-reviewed?
I believe most of them were peer-reviewed, but they weren't really focusing on research. Most of them were focusing more on clinical practice. So peer-reviewed doesn't always have to be research. So if somebody has a treatment program or a theoretical idea or framework, as long as it goes through the same process, that's how we learn, that's how we move the field forward, that's how we all continue to learn about things we now know that we didn't know 20 years ago, things like that.
Okay, and then later on was there research about, research actually relating to floating profiles and borderline personality?
Yes, that was actual research that again was peer-reviewed and then published, not in my journals, I mean we weren't involved in that, but in other recognized journals.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about then Exhibit 646, which is the computer printout or computer scoring of the TSI. And this would be, are you familiar with the trauma symptom inventory that was conducted by Dr. DeMarte? Those are the hand scoring you just saw, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you know the timeline in which she gave it to Ms. Arias? In other words, when did she want these symptoms to be reported from?
She indicated that this particular one was to be from equivalent of 2007, 2008, prior to arrest, at least that's my understanding.
Okay. And so, and is that something possible?
Well, it's not ideal. I mean, you're having the person try to recall the way they were then and to respond. Ideally, it would have been good to administer that test at the time and then possibly again at a different time. It's definitely not the ideal way of doing something, what we call retrospective. It's not what I would like to do. Ideally, I'd like to do it at the time, but if we aren't able to, then at least it gives us an idea. Again, not conclusively, not to make a diagnosis, but again, we're looking at working hypothesis, what makes sense. So it does give you some information.
Okay. All right. And so let's talk about the working hypothesis of anxiety or PTSD and trauma. Okay?
Yes, well, that's the things. If you have the profile, it might make it easier to see. But because this lists it, the other shows you on a summary scale, like, yes.
This one?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Because then it's easier maybe for people to see that.
Okay.
Even though it's a little smaller, again, so we look at what's average, what's above average, what's clinical. Oh, that was nice. So 50 again here is average. 65 again, a little bit like the MMPI, is in the clinical cutoff range. So those are the things we look at. These three scales here on this side are the validity scales. Did the person answer consistently? Are they giving responses that are really sort of bizarre and atypical? Are they giving you things that seem to fit in what we know about people, you know, who take this test? And you can see they're all in, all in the average range below clinical, meaning it's a valid profile. So that's the first thing we look at in this test. Then we look at which of the scales that are elevated above this level. And you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the 10 test scales are elevated in the clinical area. So we focus on that, and then we come back to these over here.
Are those the summary scales?
Those are the three summary scales. So what this instrument does is it not only looks at trauma overall, which is this right here, based on these results, well, the other scales, I don't know how to get, like your hand was there, but, and then these tell you other parts of the overall scale, like what's the mood level, what's the way this person views themselves. So these sort of combine the whole test into those three summary scales to determine whether it's likely that this person suffered trauma and or may have a diagnosis of PTSD.
And this particular instrument,
Excuse me.
does does it necessarily focus on one particular trauma, or does it talk about facts of a trauma, or just trauma in general?
No, this one is looking at trauma in general and symptoms and impact. In fact, it doesn't ask specifically for what may have traumatized you. It doesn't focus on the particular act. It focuses on the impact of whatever this person is reviewing. But it's actually looking, the reason it's called a symptom inventory, it's asking you what symptoms you may have. It is actually not necessarily asking you if you've been traumatized or had a traumatic event. It's saying, like, in the last whatever this time period is, you know, have you had nightmares? Have you had difficulty going to sleep? Have you been overly concerned about your sexual interactions? I mean, it does all those things. I don't want to go into too many. I don't want to give you the questions, but basically it's asking the person about symptoms. There's 100 of these. So it's looking at that, and then because of the research that's been done over a couple of decades, it puts it together now into these different scales that we can now interpret based on that. So it's not asking the person, him or herself, at all about what might have caused this behavior or what the action might have been. So, I mean, it could also be that this person has had several traumatic incidences in their life because we're focusing on their symptoms now. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
And so we talked about these 10 scales and then the summary scales.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you aware that Dr. DeMarte indicated that the TSI does not have summary scales, that they don't exist?
Objection, she indicated that the hand scored one did not have it, not the computer one.
You may continue.
So, Dr. Geffner, do you have information that Dr. DeMarte at some point indicated that summary scales do not exist?
Objection. What we indicated was she was going to say that. She told him.
Stayed.
Based on our conversations, are you aware of that?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And is that in any way true?
That they don't have, well, it's obviously not true. They're here. And you have two ways of getting those summary scales. A is the computer scoring, which is typical, which actually produces this. If you're not computer scoring it and you're hand scoring it, it tells you in the scoring manual how you end up getting these three scales, which things you add up in order to get it. So either way, the summary scales, A, exist, and they're part of the way you use this instrument. That's part of what you use it for.
Okay, so if Dr. DeMarte just did the hand scoring, did that in any way prevent her from coming up with summary scales?
No, ma'am.
And in fact, if she would have read the directions on the scoring manual, would she have known? Would it have explained to her how to do the summary scales?
Yes, ma'am.
So in any way, shape, or form, is it true just because somebody hand scores the trauma symptom inventory, you can't get summary scales?
That is not accurate. Unless that was a double negative, I wasn't sure if I answered that the way. You can get summary scales.
Overruled.
You can get summary scales whether you hand score it, use templates, or computer score. It's easier with computer scoring, but it doesn't preclude you from doing the other.
Okay. And this particular test was the TSI-1, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you aware of any other TSI tests, trauma symptom inventory tests?
Yes, ma'am.
What else is there?
There is the TSI-2 that updates, expands, and has renormed the TSI.
Okay, and so when did that come out?
The TSI-2 came out in early 2011, around February, March 2011.
And do you know when Dr. DeMarte did the TSI?
Yes, ma'am.
When was that?
Summer of 2011.
And so at the time that she gave the TSI-1, was the TSI-2 available?
Yes, ma'am.
What is it, as a psychologist in your training, especially training others, and your experience, is it appropriate for someone to use an outdated test?
No, and that's part of your responsibilities is to stay current on whatever you're using and to use what's most current and most updated. Just like the MMPI-2, it would not be appropriate to use the MMPI-1 anymore once the other's been out. Or a lot of these tests. I mean, over time, populations change, people change, norms change.
Sustained.
Why is it important to use the updated versions?
Because over time people change, our society is not the same now as it was 20 years ago, people respond differently, so you, in our terminology, use norms. In other words, you go back and you see how people now respond to these, and you revise questions. Some questions may not make sense in our current age of technology and all the advances we've made. So some questions have to be thrown out, some have to be added, which is what tests do that are standardized. So the TSI-2 did that and was available and publicized in early 2011.
What about if Dr. DeMarte told us that she didn't have the updated test because her employer didn't buy it? Is that an ethical, is that a good reason to not give an updated test?
Objection. It was actually defense counsel who told us.
Rephrase.
If Dr. DeMarte told us that she did not give the TSI-2 because her employer didn't get it for her at the time, is that a good enough reason to not give a updated test?
No. If you're administering a test, there's requirements. A, you have to understand the test, and you have to be trained in it, or at least have the training to do it. Otherwise, it's not clear you would be administering it or scoring it or interpreting it correctly. Second is you are supposed to be current on the research. And I mean, we knew that TSI-2 was coming out a year before because it was already publicized it was going to be coming out. So not using an updated test unless there's a particular research reason that, you know, has been shown, like the new test is not good for A, and that's A is what you want to find out, then you might use the old one. But barring that, really to say, well, I have 10 of these in my office, I'm going to use them up because I don't want to buy more or because somebody didn't get it, it's incumbent on you and your responsibilities as a psychologist to do what's the most appropriate battery of tests. If your employer, in your example, says, I don't have it, then it's up to you to tell your employer, hey, it's easy to get. You just, you know, call up the psychological assessment resources and order another set. And then if they refuse, I don't know they did, but if they do, then you shouldn't be using the old version anyway. Then it'd be better not to use either and use a whole different test.
Okay. And you said that that you knew that the TSI-2 was coming out long before it did. So is it any surprise that there's an updated version coming out soon?
No, not at the time.
People who work in this field.
No, Dr. Briere had already started doing presentations at trauma conferences. People around the country were already involved in the test sites with the renorming. He had already announced, and the publisher of the test had announced that it would be coming out in 2011. So it wasn't a surprise. I mean, people don't do that. They don't surprise you. I mean, they let you know what's happening.
All right. So anybody who's working in a specialty of trauma, should they have been aware that the TSI-2 was coming out?
Yes.
All right. So let's talk then about what we see on these scales.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us? Can you tell us what when we're looking at these scales? What is it that we're seeing?
Well, first, the way you would focus on this would be, again, what's in the cutoff range. So first thing we notice, as I mentioned, is 7 of these out of the 10 are in the clinical range. That's indicating pretty significant trauma symptoms. You don't get that normally. And again, keeping in mind, our validity scales were within the normal range. So this suggests that this person is suffering some pretty major symptoms based on some trauma or traumas. We don't know what they were from this, but we know they occurred. So then we start looking. So there's 2 ways we deal with this. First, we interpret it, well, 3. First, we interpret it with looking at these particular scales. Then we interpret it with respect to the summary scales. Then we look at, has this been administered before, and is it consistent with prior administrations? Then we look at, is it consistent with other tests? You keep going as you're dealing with your working hypotheses.
Okay, so let's, with your first one, what's the first step?
Okay, so this AA is anxious arousal. D is depression. Those are in the DA is defensive avoidance. In other words,
I was going to say, tell me what defensive avoidance is.
Okay, so this means somebody is trying, at least inside their head, what we call cognitively, to not think about or talk about the trauma. They're trying to block it out, trying to avoid dealing with it, or avoid thinking about it. Any of those would go into this scale. This scale is called dissociation. That means trying to literally block out unpleasant ideas, thoughts, feelings that are coming, perhaps trying to block out the event, spacing out, separating out your thoughts from your feelings. So even if you remember the event, blocking out the feelings that went with it so you're not overwhelmed. It's a coping mechanism so we can survive and move on. So that's in the clinical range. These 2 here deal with sexuality issues. SC is sexual concerns, meaning the person is concerned about their attitudes, are thinking about the way they view sexuality and sexual interactions. All those things go into whether they're concerned about their own sexual interactions, behaviors, things like that. It's an attitude issue. This one here, which is the highest scale, is called dysfunctional sexual behavior, meaning this person is very concerned about the way they have acted sexually, either with different partners or the types of acts, internalizing a lot of trauma from it, guilt, all sorts of things go into their behaviors. It could be multiple partners, it could be the unprotected sex, all those types of actions would go into this scale. And then this scale here, ISR, is called impaired self-reference, that these various symptoms are producing a pretty major impact on the way they view themselves, their self-image, their identity is being affected by the trauma or traumas. And so those are all in the clinical range. So then the next thing we would do would be look at the summary scales.
Okay, and that's these 3 over here, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
So, because we're now looking at actually possible diagnoses. And so the first one is trauma. Overall level of trauma, is it in the clinical range that might lead you to suspect post-traumatic stress disorder? Again, I want to emphasize, if all somebody gave was this one instrument and then they said this person suffers from PTSD, that would not be appropriate. It's part of your jigsaw puzzle and part of looking at working hypotheses. So, but this is indicating clinically above cutoffs for trauma, overall trauma. The next one is self, meaning this person is having some major issues with the way they feel about themselves, view themselves, identity issues, self-confidence are all being impacted by whatever these trauma or traumas are. And lastly, dysphoria, that this is affecting their mood, depression, anxiety. These things are being affected by whatever, again, the traumas are. That's the way this would be viewed, and then you'd want to compare it to say if the test had been administered at another time.
Okay, and are you aware of whether or not this test, the TSI-1, was administered at another time?
Yes, I am.
And when was that?
It was administered a year and a half before this, actually in the spring of 2010.
Okay, and who administered that?
Dr. Cheryl Karp.
Okay, and so, and it was the TSI-1, right? It's the same exact
Well,
test?
then it was appropriate. The new one hadn't come out.
Okay, and are you aware of the scaled results from Dr. Karp's TSI-1?
Yes, ma'am.
And are they similar? Are they different? What do you see?
Similar. The validity scales over here were also normal, according to Dr. Karp, and then...
Specified from another document. Mark, please.
I don't think he was looking at a document, Judge.
No, I was just pointing on the screen.
All right.
The lack of foundation as to the other document. Where is it?
Oh.
Judge, may we approach?
You may. You may continue.
All right, Dr. Kepner, just let me know if you need to review, if you need to look at Dr. Karp's report. If you don't need to, that's fine.
I do not.
Okay. All right, so tell me that we were talking about the similarities and differences.
Yes. So the validity scales were in the normal range on that test also. In her test, 6 of the 10 scales here were clinically elevated. The difference, so it's a similar profile, a year and a half apart. The differences between Dr. Karp's and Dr. DeMarte's is that this scale here that you see, it's called intrusive experiences. That means like flashbacks, the thoughts coming back into your head when you don't want to. When Dr. Karp did it, this was in the elevated range as one of the scales. So it had dropped in that year and a half. And then these 2 scales, the ones with sexual concerns and dysfunctional sexual behavior, had increased. Those were not in the clinical range. So over time, those things were becoming more dominant in the way the person was thinking about it, getting more concerned, reflecting over time, and these scales now became much more problematic. On the summary scales, both the trauma and the dysphoria scales were clinically elevated, dysphoria a little bit higher. So even though it's still in the clinical range, the mood wasn't quite as depressed a year and a half prior to this as then, but the self scale had moved from the high average range. It had now, over time, thinking more about self-image, self-concept, had now moved into the clinical range. But in general, both tests would indicate, even though by different people over different time periods, significant trauma, significant issues that were causing major symptoms to the way this person views themselves, the way they are experiencing things, the anxiety level, and so they would be consistent with an anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder.
And if Dr. DeMarte termed the similarities between the TSI-1 given by Dr. Karp and the TSI-1 given by herself, Dr. DeMarte, if she termed those as similar, pretty much the same, would you agree with that?
Yes, they were, with those 3 different changes, which you want to note, because again, your job as a clinician or a diagnostician is to understand the data there. Your job is not to make it go one way or another, it's to help understand it for that jigsaw puzzle. So yeah, those would be similar profiles, and you'd want to understand what might change some.
You might want to understand what?
What some of the changes were, and does it make sense. So, but yes, I would agree with her that they are similar profiles.
Okay. And on this TSI-1, how many questions are there?
100.
100. All right. And so that means that a year and a half apart, in order to get these similar profiles, what does a person have to do to get similar profiles with these 100 questions?
Well, they have to answer the questions of what symptoms they're experiencing. There's no way somebody would know. They would have to hopefully be relying on what they're actually experiencing. It would be very unlikely that somebody a year and a half apart would remember how they answered those questions. So that's a way of also checking, is this a pattern of behavior? In other words, did something all of a sudden happen in that time period that added and the scales went up? Somebody who was functioning normally before and now they've had a traumatic reaction and now they're suffering, you can use the test that way. But with a year and a half apart, we're looking at a consistent pattern of trauma.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else that you would do with regard to this test?
Well, after that, I mean, you now have working hypotheses, so I'm sorry.
Approach, please.
So based on what you see in Dr. DeMarte's TSI and Dr. Karp's TSI, the trauma tests, what does it do with our hypothesis for PTSD or anxiety or trauma?
Well, it supports those issues. So then the question, again, this test doesn't tell you what the trauma was or is. So the next is to determine what is the traumatic events, singular or plural, that led to the consistent hypotheses now across all these tests. So are we talking about particular events, a long-term history of events? That's where your records, collateral information, your interviews need to focus is trying now to explain what may have led to this situation.
Okay. Before we move on, can we talk about whether or not the TSI, this trauma test, if it can tell us anything about borderline personality?
Well, we can talk about it, but it doesn't do that.
Okay. Can you use this test in any way to support a hypothesis of borderline personality?
Not really. I mean, it's not designed to deal with personality disorders at all. It's designed to deal with trauma. Now, the difficulty is those things overlap. So
what things overlap?
Borderline personality disorder or borderline characteristics can impact or be impacted by trauma. So impaired self-reference, dissociation, some of these things that come about from trauma can also be involved in, say, borderline personality disorder. So this test is in no way designed to assess a personality disorder, but theoretically, if the person has borderline personality disorder and no traumas in their history or nothing that was a traumatic reaction, then you might see some of these particular scales elevated, but theoretically you shouldn't see this elevated, or you shouldn't see some of these.
When you say this, what do you mean?
I'm sorry. The trauma scale would not be elevated, but you could get certain scales elevated. For example, you could get the dissociation scale elevated. You can get the impaired self-reference, not from trauma, but something else. But then the trauma things like defensive avoidance, like this trauma one here, intrusive experiences, those things then would tend not to be, because they tend to be associated with trauma. So you can indeed have somebody who has, in our language, co-occurring disorders. That means they have two things. They could be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline or other things. Or you could have somebody who has post-traumatic stress disorder and they have major depression. It is incumbent on the diagnostician to look at that, because in our diagnostic code, it basically says if you have a clinical diagnosis, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, that's what you diagnose. You don't diagnose a personality disorder unless it is actually co-occurring. That means unless you can show that separate from the trauma, you have these other things going on. What that would mean more in English is that if somebody had a long history of harming themselves, of unstable relationships, of dissociating, of suicide attempts, or things like that, long before going back into adolescence, then you might have a borderline personality disorder. Now that doesn't eliminate PTSD, but if your trauma comes from something that happened, say, in adulthood, then that would be a reason to give both diagnoses. But if all your symptoms of borderline or anything else occurred at the time or after the traumatic reaction, then it's not appropriate to diagnose with that. You diagnose with the PTSD or anxiety disorder or whatever it is that's the major issue going on. And that's listed in the manual for diagnosticians. So you could have two, not based on this test, but that's the way you would use the test to look at determining diagnoses.
Okay. So as a hypothetical, if someone got PTSD from an abusive relationship, being involved in an abusive relationship. Approach, please.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Geffner, as a hypothetical, if someone were to get PTSD or suffer from PTSD because they were involved in an abusive relationship, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
And because of this abusive relationship, they were suffering from trauma, okay? But they also exhibited borderline personality characteristics. What you're telling us is that they could have both, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But would it be appropriate in coming to a conclusion about borderline personality, would it be appropriate to use anything, any factors during the time of this abusive relationship in which the trauma is occurring?
In order to diagnose
Borderline.
the borderline? No. If you have a diagnosis of PTSD or anxiety disorder or something from known events and matches, say, your testing and all your borderline behaviors, actions occurred during that same time period, then no, that would not. You'd have to have a prior history of those behaviors long-term, going back into adolescence, to diagnose any personality disorder. So they would have to have both to get both diagnoses.
Okay. And when you talk about long-term, back into adolescence, are you looking at just one thing that happened, or are you going to want to see patterns of these behaviors?
For diagnosing borderline, you need to have patterns of behavior, and it would need to meet all the various criteria for borderline that would have to have a history of that. You wouldn't be able to have two things that happen, say, in adolescence, two other things that happen, say, when you're 25, three other things that happened when you were 32, and then you're adding those up. You would really need to have a history of those criteria and a pretty consistent history of those things happening before whatever other events you're talking about.
Okay, so we would want to see a consistent history then before this abusive relationship then?
In your hypothetical, yes.
Okay. So then based on what we see in this TSI and the other TSI, then is it consistent or not with our working hypothesis of PTSD and anxiety?
Right now it's consistent.
Okay. And when we don't just look at the TSI and we look at the other tests that we've discussed so far this morning, what does that do to our hypothesis with PTSD and anxiety and trauma?
Right now all your tests are not supporting a personality disorder. All your tests are supporting some type of anxiety or trauma disorder.
Okay. All right, so you talked about after this, is there a specific test that can go into the types of trauma?
There are quite a few, two more typically used ones.
All right, what are those?
The detailed assessment of post-traumatic stress, abbreviated DAPS, also created by Dr. Briere. That one tends to focus more on the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and it talks about particular events that the person lists. That one I view as being better because it has validity scales again, and it's more detailed, it's more current. Another one though is called the the post-traumatic distress scale, the PDS, which also has a research basis. It does not have validity scales, but it also focuses on particular trauma incidents.
Okay. And when you talk about research basis, what do you mean?
Well, it means that there's some research behind it, but it's not a major norm group type of test. It's all, that test, the post-traumatic distress, is based more on criteria. In other words, we say, does this person have this behavior? Does it have this behavior? Does it have this behavior? We know that those are the behaviors that make up the diagnosis. But it's not like some of these other tests where they're actually researched on how people check off symptoms. It's hard to describe. In my language, it's like the difference between quantitative research and qualitative. One uses research data and statistical analysis. The other is matching the questions with the diagnosis you're trying to end up with or to verify. It's a little hard to explain without getting too technical, but so there are different ways of looking at the thing. But the PDS does not have specific validity scales.
Okay. And without validity scales, can it still be used?
Oh, yes. It's telling you what the client, whoever it is saying, and whether what they're saying matches the criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD and what level of severity it's at. But it's based on, again, I mean, these are all based on self-report, but there's no check on that one. Basically, a client says, yes, I had this traumatic incident, and then you ask about a variety of things related to that incident. You know, did you have nightmares about it? Did you, were you afraid? And then you check off these boxes, and then it produces whether the person met the various criteria for that, for PTSD.
Okay.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right. And did you review the PDS test that was given to Ms. Arias?
Yes, ma'am.
And in your review of the PDS test that was given to Ms. Arias, did she meet the according to that test, did she meet the criteria for PTSD?
Yes, ma'am.
And you said that's what it's specifically designed to do, this particular test?
Is designed to do two things. One is to tell you whether the person met all the criteria, whether it would qualify, if they did, for what's called an acute onset, meaning it happened right after the event, or a more chronic onset, meaning it's continued and had longer effects. And then it's designed to tell you what level of severity that is.
Okay. All right. And in this particular test, it focuses, unlike the TSI, is it focusing on what the trauma might be? Or
yes.
the different traumas the person has suffered?
It's based on what the person has indicated. So it asks the person a whole bunch of questions like, were you assaulted by a stranger? Were you assaulted by a family member? Were you assaulted sexually? Were you assaulted physically? So you are noting the type of events that you have experienced, and then it's saying, okay, of these various events, which do you feel was either the most traumatic or the one that you feel is impacting you the most? And then the questions go from there. Okay.
And with regard to this particular PDS test, on part 2, and I'm showing you Exhibit 550, on part 2, does it tell us, under question 14, does it tell us what the person feels the most significant trauma is?
Yes, that box number 4 checks off what the particular question is.
Okay. And number 4, does that relate to an assault by a stranger?
Yes, that's what that question is asking.
Okay. And then it asks the person to briefly describe the traumatic event, right?
Yes.
And we see here that it says assaulted/life threatened.
Yes, ma'am.
So my question to you then is, if there is an assault on this person and this person felt that her life was threatened, and she says on this test that it is traumatic to her, okay, would it matter as far as PTSD or trauma is concerned whether or not who did it to her?
The test would not matter, the criterion would not, because it's then assuming this is what you're talking about, this event, and then it's from there on it doesn't focus on the event, it focuses on the impact of that event in nightmares, in intrusive experiences, in anxiety, in disruption of your life, things like that. That's what it focuses on from that point on.
All right. And in your experience, you've told us that you have a lot of experience with, obviously, trauma victims and domestic violence victims. In your experience, do people ever not report correctly about who assaulted them?
Objection, relevance.
Approach. May continue.
All right, Dr. Geffner, so the fact that if we're talking about somebody who doesn't report accurately about who caused this trauma, does that ultimately affect whether or not they actually have trauma? Let me ask that in a different way. If the person says that, let me give you this example. If a person says that they were attacked by a tiger, but in reality they were attacked by a bear, either way, they're telling you that they've suffered trauma. Is it going to matter one way or the other?
No, not for this test or for a diagnosis of PTSD. It's the reaction.
He's not finished answering.
Overruled. You may continue.
It's the reaction to the event that is assessed and goes into the diagnosis, as long as there was some type of traumatic event. The diagnosis requires there to be a traumatic event. It doesn't require what it is. So either one of those would qualify, but the test is focusing on the reaction to it.
Okay. And I think you talked about, with regard to PTSD, does it have to be one event or can it be multiple events?
Oh, it can easily be multiple. I mean, you can have somebody who suffers a trauma in childhood from child abuse or being bullied, to later being a victim of date rape, to later being a victim of domestic violence. Unfortunately, what we know from the research...
What do we know from the research with regard to PTSD and having one event versus multiple events?
Objection relevance.
Overruled.
We know from the research that if you have a traumatic event early on, what is called adverse childhood experiences, and there are a variety of things that qualify for that, whether in childhood or adolescence, it increases the odds of being victimized again if there's no intervention or treatment. So it's not unusual for somebody, unfortunately, to have some type of traumatic stressor that produces the symptoms.
Scope.
Approach. May continue.
Finish what you were telling us about with childhood trauma and unfortunately what happens?
When somebody has experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences, and the more they experience, the worse it is later on too, they are much more at risk for later traumatic experiences that affect their mental health, their physical health. We have a lot of research now that shows that this is a lifespan approach if there's no intervention, so that somebody who's been victimized in childhood is a much greater risk of being victimized later, or if they're victimized in adolescence, for example, a victim of date rape, or they end up at a higher risk for other victimizations later on.
Okay.
So it does not have to be one event. You can have one event. You could have an acute stressor like an earthquake or something like that, or an assault. But you can also have a whole series of chronic events where you may not have been physically or sexually touched, but you grew up in a home that had so much trauma and chaos and abuse that it traumatizes you.
Okay. All right, I want to talk to you about and I don't know the full name for it, the rat, Wechsler. The RAT test.
The
Oh,
RAT
wide.
is called the Wide Range Achievement Test, and there's various versions.
Okay. All right. Are you aware of whether or not Dr. DeMarte gave this test?
Yes.
All right. What is this test? What does this test mean to?
It's an achievement test. If you do the various subscales, it'll tell you what level the person is reading, spelling, arithmetic, etc. Like the 8th grade level, high school level, above. It's a standardized achievement test.
Okay. And how long do these tests normally take to give?
Depends on how many subscales or subtests are administered. It could be anywhere from 20 minutes to closer to an hour, depending on if you administer all and they keep going through it.
Okay. And the other test is, there's another test known as the WAIS. That's the Wechsler one, right?
Yes, the Wechsler is the Adult Intelligence Scales. There's also various versions. It's in the 4th versions. That's a measure of intellectual functioning. At least it gives you IQ scores in different arenas.
All right. And are you aware of whether or not Dr. DeMarte gave this test as well?
Yes.
And incidentally, were these tests both updated?
Yes.
The ones that she gave?
Yes.
Okay. And so, do these tests provide any type of psychological diagnosis?
No.
Anything? So if Dr. DeMarte tells or says that the reasoning for giving this test was to provide any information regarding psychological diagnosis or state of mind at the time of the incident, or Ms. Arias' emotional functioning. If Dr. DeMarte were to say that, do these tests do that?
No, they do not. They are very specific in those particular areas, looking at, again, my language is cognitive functioning, the different skills, abilities the person has in the academic arena, their vocabulary, their verbal skills, their ability to put blocks and other things together. In my language, that's called spatial relations. They're very specific for those types of things. They are not psychological measures from the standpoint of anything we've been talking about today. They don't lead to diagnosis, other than if the person has mental retardation. That would be a diagnosis that you could obtain partially from those tests. Or if they have a learning disability, you can get an idea from those tests whether they might, that you should explore further. But from a psychological standpoint, emotional, no, they're not connected.
Okay. So in this situation, prior to giving the MMPI-2, would it have been appropriate for Dr. DeMarte to give these two tests, the RAT and the WAIS, in your opinion?
Based on the role you define, no, they wouldn't have provided any meaningful information that you could not get for the other test by having the person talk to you or read the first paragraph of the MMPI to make sure they can read at the 5th grade level and understand it. That would take a couple of minutes. There's no other reason that those would be connected to trying to determine a diagnosis.
Okay. And are you familiar with other psychologists who have given these types of tests in situations where they're not needed?
Oh, yes.
And how does that happen?
Objection to relevance.
Overruled.
Two ways. One of the things in graduate schools virtually all over this country is there's quite a bit of effort spent on training psychologists, including ours, on how to administer the adult intelligence scales and the achievement tests and others, especially if you're evaluating for competency or your disability or looking at kids for learning disabilities. So there's a lot of training. So most psychologists are trained on those tests. Because many psychologists are not trained on other tests or understand them, they use what they do know. So you see this happening over and over in cases we deal with regularly, where these are used and they're not meaningful in what we're looking at, because it makes it look like you've done a comprehensive battery. I've given all these tests. Well, these aren't relevant. So we see in cases we deal with where people administer that, to say it's that, also it increases their hours and fees. But it's not meaningful, it's not relevant for what you're looking at.
And so in this particular case, was it meaningful or relevant at all, in your opinion?
That's correct. What the results...
Abstained.
Oh.
The noon recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you take an abbreviated lunch today. 1 hour and 15 minutes, so please be back at 1:20, and we will start promptly at that time. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
Counsel, if you could be back here by 1:15, we are at recess.